In my video on pomegranates and prostate cancer, pomegranate pills appeared useless in the treatment for prostate cancer, and the same disappointing results with a pomegranate beverage, but that was just a pomegranate extract as well. So maybe the pomegranate itself cannot be blamed for the ineffectiveness seen in the study, but rather the low dose of the pomegranate active principles in the extract. But what is the active principle? Extracts will boast about the level of ellagic acid. Definitely one of the more potent of the phytochemicals found in pomegranate. However, it's not as strong as the pomegranate itself. What they mean is that the components may act synergistically. The whole may be greater than the sum of its parts. Here's human prostate cancer cells in a petri dish churning away at 100% growth, but drip on this pomegranate fraction, and the cancer growth rate is cut 30%. But this other fraction appeared useless. So what if you add them both together? What do you think would happen? 30% suppression plus 0 suppression equals 70% suppression. That's synergy, where 1 plus 1 is greater than 2. Here they are under a microscope. That's what prostate cancer cells look like. Here's with the 30% compound, here's with the useless one, and here's with both. So any attempt to characterize the power of a medicinal food by standardizing a single chemical is missing the entire point of plant-based medicine. So the standardized extracts represent a cynical, money-driven attempt to replace the power of the pomegranate with the power of ellagic acid. But the pomegranate needs no such tricks or enhancements. It's powerful as is. So why don't they just try the fruit out on cancer patients? Because you can't stuff a pomegranate in a pill. So you can't compare it to an indistinguishable sugar pill placebo. Drugs are easy to study. People don't know if they're taking the active drug or the placebo, but they tend to notice if they're eating a pomegranate or not. So if you gave a bunch of cancer patients some pomegranates to eat, and the cancer slowed down, you wouldn't know if it was the pomegranates or just the placebo effect. Of course, the patients wouldn't care. If they got better, who cares? But to change medical practice, we want to know if the fruit is actually something special. I suppose you could create some kind of pomegranate smoothie versus some fake smoothie, but that sounds logistically difficult. So researchers tried powdering it. 199 men with prostate cancer either got a placebo or a tablet 3 times a day containing 100 milligrams of whole powdered pomegranate. Now, this was the whole fruit, just with the water taken out. But even so, how much can you fit in a tablet? Comes out to be about 6 pomegranate seeds worth a day. That's about 1/100th of a pomegranate a day. Since they could fit so little in a pill, they tried to maximize their chances of beating back the cancer using diversity. If you have 2 groups of people eating approximately the same amount of fruits and vegetables, but one group ate a relatively low biological diversity diet, where they ate tons of really healthy foods, but just less variety, then smaller servings of a high-diversity diet, which group would win in terms of protecting their DNA from free radical damage? The high-diversity group. This suggests that smaller amounts of many phytochemicals may have a greater potential to exert beneficial effects than larger amounts of fewer phytochemicals. Same result for inflammation. Greater variety in fruit and vegetable intake is associated with lower inflammation, even if you eat the same number of servings. Same with improving cognitive function. Greater variety in fruit and vegetable intake was associated with a better mental status, executive function, attention, and memory function in some cases, even after adjustment for total quantity. So if you have two people eating the same number of servings of healthy foods, the one eating a greater variety may do better. So the researchers didn't just put in some pomegranate powder, they added some powdered broccoli too, and some powdered turmeric, and some powdered green tea concentrate. So a fruit, a vegetable, spice, and leaf, but tiny amounts. That's like 1 floret of broccoli a day, less than an eighth teaspoon a day of turmeric, and about 1/6 of a tea bag worth of green tea. All great plans, but could such tiny amounts actually affect the progression of cancer? Yes. In the group of men with early-stage prostate cancer trying to avoid surgery, the PSA levels rose in the placebo group, rose nearly 50%, indicating the cancer continued to flourish. Whereas in the pomegranate, broccoli, turmeric, green tea food supplement group, the PSAs didn't rise at all. And in those with more advanced disease, already had surgery or radiation, trying to avoid chemo, a 70% greater rise in the placebo group. That was enough to significantly delay some of the more toxic treatments. So significant, short-term, favorable effects. See, they only had enough money to run the study for 6 months, because it was a non-commercial endeavor funded by charity. This wasn't some supplement company. In fact, there was no supplement until the investigators dreamed it up from scratch. Of course, now there's a supplement, given the study's extraordinary results, but the only reason the researchers put the foods in pill form was to match it with the placebo. In my mind, what this study should tell cancer patients is to eat curried broccoli with fruit for dessert and sip some green tea. A completely plant-based diet may even shrink the tumor, not just slow it down, but there's no reason we can't do both. A plant-based diet chock full of especially powerful plants. We have known that lead can be toxic for thousands of years, and specifically that children could be poisoned by lead paint over a century ago. And since those first cases, the lead industry has mobilized against the advances of science. By 1926, lead poisoning was already a relatively frequent occurrence in children. Yet the United States continued to allow the use of lead-based paint until 1978. In contrast, over in Europe, many countries said, poisoning children? No thanks, and banned the use of lead paint as early as 1909. The delay in the U.S. was due largely to the proud marketing and lobbying efforts of the industry profiting from the poison. They knew they couldn't hold off forever, but boasted that their victories have been in the deferral of implementation of regulation. And now, peeling paint turns into poisonous dust, and guess where it ends up? As a Mount Sinai dean and Harvard neurology professor put it, lead is a devastating poison, damages children's brains, erodes intelligence, diminishes creativity and judgment and language and failure. Yet despite the accumulating evidence, the lead industry didn't just fail to warn people, but engaged in an energetic promotion of leaded paint. After all, a can of pure white lead paint had huge amounts of lead, which meant huge profits for the industry. But see, there's no cause to worry if your toddler smudges up against lead paint, because those fingerprints can be easily removed without harming the paint. Wouldn't want to harm the paint. After all, painted walls are sanitary. You see, as advertised by the Dutch Boys National Lead Company, lead helps to guard your health. The director of the Lead Industry Association blamed the victims, the slum-dwelling, ignorant parents. It seems that no amount of evidence, no health statistics, no public outrage could get industry to care that their paint was killing and poisoning children. But how much public outrage was there really? I mean, it goes without saying, lead is a devastating, debilitating poison. Literally millions of children have been diagnosed with various degrees of elevated lead levels. Compare that to polio, for example, though. In the 1950s, fewer than 60,000 new cases annually created a near panic among American parents, and a national mobilization led to campaigns that virtually wiped out the problem within a decade. In contrast, despite many millions of children's lives altered for the worst, at no point in the past 100 years has there been a similar national mobilization over lead. And today, after literally a century, the CDC estimates over 500,000 children still suffer from elevated blood lead levels. The good news is that blood lead levels are in decline. Celebrated as one of our great public health achievements, but given what we knew, for how long we knew, to declare this a public health victory? Even if we were victorious, it would be a victory diminished by our failure to learn from the epidemic and take steps to dramatically reduce exposures to other confirmed and suspected environmental toxicants. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do this video series on lead. We need to learn from our history, so the next time some industry wants to sell something to our kids, we'll stick to the science. Back in the 60s, a Pulitzer Prize-winning scientist described the problem of childhood lead poisoning as so well-defined, so neatly packaged, with both causes and cures known, that if we don't eliminate the social crime, our society deserves all the disasters it has coming. Well, we have the knowledge to redress this social crime. We know where the lead is, how people are exposed, and how it damages health. What we lack is the political will to do what should be done. Unfortunately, many policymakers consider the cost of action primarily in economic financial terms, and ignore the cost of inaction on human health and communities' livelihoods. At this point, most Americans have heard of the avoidable and abject failure of government on the local, state, federal level, in fact across the board, to prevent the mass poisoning of hundreds of children and adults in Flint, Michigan. A government plan to save some money had led public officials to switch the city's water source from one of the Great Lakes to the Flint River, the past sewer of the auto industry. Flint citizens complained that their tap water was foul and discolored, but officials took no heed. I wonder why. Officials failed to act for 18 months until a local pediatrician revealed dramatically elevated lead levels in children's blood. An investigation didn't just find fault, but highlighted seeming falsification of water quality results to keep people in the dark. Though the specific breed of alleged government corruption may be unique to Flint, the end result might not be so rare in the USA, home to an aging water system. As the president of the Children's Health Fund has said, Pandora's box is now wide open. Flint may only be the tip of an enormous iceberg, potentially one of a great many icebergs. In addition to lead paint and the residual lead everywhere from leaded gasoline, lead can leach from lead pipes, solder, or fixtures. Recognized to be a health issue in the U.S., back in 1845, a year our flag only had 26 stars. Yet the use of lead in water pipes and solder was not restricted until the Safe Drinking Water Act amendment 141 years later. Was the city you're living in built before 1986? Today, the exact number of lead water pipes currently in use is not clear. About 1 in 3 cities surveyed shrugged their shoulders. There are anti-corrosion chemicals you can add to tap water to try to keep the lead in the pipes. Flint could have done that, but it could have cost about $100 a day. Now they only have to pay $1 billion. Let me close with a quote from the heroic pediatrician who blew the whistle, Dr. Hannah Atisha. She was asked, "What advice would you have for other physicians taking on a whistleblower role?" She replied, "This is our job. This is why we went to medical school, to help people." As the whistleblowing pediatrician who helped expose the Flint drinking water crisis put it, the people in Flint have a 20-year lower life expectancy than people in a neighboring suburb. We were already struggling with every barrier to our children's success. Then we gave them lead. Her research showed that the switch in water supplies from the Great Lakes to the polluted Flint River created a perfect storm for lead contamination, doubling the percentage of kids with elevated lead levels in their blood. Whereas out in the suburbs, where they kept the same water supply, children's lead levels stayed about the same. That's how we knew it was the switch in water supplies. That's what broke the story of the Flint crisis, a doubling of elevated lead levels. But wait a second. Even before the switch, when everyone was getting the same water, lead levels in children in Flint were twice that of the suburbs. There was already a doubling in elevated lead levels in Flint and other poor communities around the country, yet where have all the crisis headlines been? So even with all the bottled water in the world, the children in Flint will continue to live in a lead-polluted environment. Many have pointed out the irony that the new water from the Flint River was so corrosive that the General Motors plant switched back to a clean water source when they started noticing rust spots on their new parts, all the while water quality complaints from Flint residents were being ignored. But there is an additional irony. General Motors is a major reason why the world is so contaminated with lead in the first place, as GM invented leaded gasoline. Shortly after manufacture began, workers began to become floridly psychotic and die. In the wake of blaring headlines about the lead-poisoned workers, public health leaders warned of the potential for damage to broad swaths of the population posed by putting a well-established toxin into gasoline. Yet despite these warnings, millions upon millions were harmed, and this entirely preventable poisoning still occurs today. Virtually all the lead in the environment today is because we put it there. It used to be locked away deep underground or under the ocean, but that was before we drove it around the Earth. By the 1970s, 200,000 tons of lead was emitted from cars and trucks in the United States each year, mostly in urban areas. Otherwise, the industry would have to use a higher octane gas, which is less profitable. So the oil and lead industry successfully thwarted government efforts to limit lead in gasoline for 50 years. But how were they able to do that? Because the industry assured the scientific community and the public that there was no danger. Okay, I could see how a gullible public could be swayed by slick PR, but how do you manipulate the scientific community? By manipulating the science. The lead industry was able to achieve its influence in large part by being the primary supporter of research on the health effects of lead, and they got the best science money could buy. Long before big tobacco, the lead industry understood the inestimable value of purchasing quote-unquote good science. Consequently, the vast majority of relevant studies published for decades were favorable to the lead industry. They even sent a delegation to try to convince the EPA that lead regulation wasn't necessary because they claimed lead was an essential nutrient required for optimal growth and development. Of course, the exact opposite is true, toxic to development. But there are nutritional interventions that can help alleviate lead toxicity. For example, food components that can help decrease the absorption of lead and help flush it out of your body. I've got a series of 3 videos coming up on specific dietary interventions, particular foods to eat, but spoiler alert, in general, food patterns that reduce susceptibility to lead toxicity tend to be consistent with just recommendations for a healthy diet. By the 1950s, lead, a dangerous neurotoxin that was once buried deep in the ground far, far away, had polluted the entire planet, thanks to leaded gasoline. It's hard to imagine a better way for maximizing population exposure to a poison than to have it emitted by a ubiquitous mobile source to line the surfaces of our neighborhoods with it. Overall, about 5 million metric tons of lead was deposited. A single busy street could receive more than a ton a year, and the lead just built up decade after decade, but at least, thanks to regulations starting in the 70s, we stopped spewing so much into the air. And as lead use dropped, so did the levels of lead in our blood, resulting in a 98% reduction in the percentage of young children with elevated blood lead levels. Of course, the term elevated is relative. Prior to 1970, lead toxicity was defined as 60 micrograms per deciliter or higher. But then they dropped the definition to 40, then 30, then 25, then 10, as lead levels previously thought to be safe or inconsequential for children was consistently shown to be risk factors for cognitive and behavioral problems. Currently, elevated is considered more than 5, but under 5, your lead level is considered non-elevated, normal. But what does having a normal lead level mean? Virtually all residents of industrialized countries have bone lead stores that are several orders of magnitude greater than those of our pre-industrial ancestors. If you go to a museum and test the lead levels of ancient skeletons buried a millennia ago, they have 1,000 times lower lead level compared to people today, which indicates the probable existence within most Americans of dysfunctions caused by poisoning from chronic excessive overexposure to industrial lead. This is a graphical representation where each dot represents 40 micrograms of lead. The amount of lead in the right figure represents overtly symptomatic lead poisoning, where you might be doubled over in pain, whereas the middle figure is the lead in a typical American citizen, and the left figure is how much they found in pre-industrial bodies. See, what the medical and research community has failed to understand is that they've just been looking at these 2 figures. People with lead poisoning, and those of us down at normal levels, so-called very low levels. But what this new data on what's natural for our species shows is that typical levels of lead in humans are quite definitely not very low at all, but instead constitute grossly excessive 1,000-fold overexposure levels. The bottom line is that no level of lead exposure appears to be safe, and even the current quote-unquote low levels of exposure in children are associated with neurodevelopmental deficits, including reduced IQ. But hey, it could have been a lot worse if we hadn't started restricting leaded gas. Thanks to falling blood lead levels starting in the 70s, preschoolers born in the 90s were like 2 to 5 IQ points smarter than kids like me born before 1976. So when we see our kids and grandkids being such whizzes at technology that it's hard to keep up with them, a small part of that may be them not suffering as much lead-induced brain damage as we did. And what that means for the country is potentially hundreds of billions of dollars of improved productivity because our kids are less brain damaged. If that seems like a lot for just a few IQ points, what you have to realize is that even a small shift in average IQ could result in a 50% increase in the number of so-called mentally retarded, millions more in need of special education and services. So the removal of lead from gasoline in the United States may be one of the great public health achievements of the 20th century. But it almost did not happen. Tremendous pressure by the lead industry was brought to bear to quiet, even intimidate, researchers and clinicians who dared report on or identify lead as a hazard. Decent scientists and health officials faced enormous opposition, but never lost sight of the mandate to protect public health. In this personal perspective, two of the idealistic young employees at the newly formed EPA, who played key roles in the fight, recount how naive they were to the ways of Washington. Our youth was used against us, they recall, their inexperience cited as a reason for rejecting their proposals. In retrospect, however, their youth and inexperience may have helped them to succeed in taking on a billion-dollar industry. We were too young to know that regulating lead in gasoline was impossible. Children in approximately 4 million households in the United States are being exposed to high levels of lead. Despite the dramatic decline in children's blood lead concentrations over the decades, lead toxicity remains a major public health problem, and not just for children. Yes, lead is a devastating neurotoxin, starting with learning disabilities and attention deficits in children starting around a blood lead level of 10 micrograms per deciliter, which is when you start seeing high blood pressure and nerve damage in adults. But the blood levels in American adults these days is down around 1, not 10, unless you work or play in an indoor firing range, where the lead levels in the air are so high, more than half of recreational target shooters have levels over 10 or even 25. In fact, even open-air outdoor ranges can be a problem. Spending just 2 days a month at a range may quadruple blood lead levels up into the danger zone. But what if you don't use firearms, or live in a house with someone who uses firearms? The lead levels can be so high the CDC advises those who go to shooting ranges shower there, change into clean clothes, don't mix clean clothes with contaminated clothes, don't bring your shoes home, etc. Even if none of that applies, and your blood levels are under 10, there's still some evidence of increased risk of hand tremors and high blood pressure and kidney damage and other issues. But come on, just 1? I mean, what if you're down around a blood level of 1, like most people? We didn't know until this study, which found that blood lead levels, even in the range currently considered acceptable, are associated with an increased prevalence of the painful arthritis known as gout. They found blood levels as low as approximately 1.2 can be associated with increased prevalence of gout, which is close to the current American average. So this means quote-unquote very low levels of lead may still be associated with health risks, suggesting there's no such thing as a safe level of exposure to lead. OK, but where is the lead coming from? Lead only circulates in your body for about a month, so if you have lead in your bloodstream, it's some ongoing exposure. But most adults don't eat peeling paint chips. There's no more leaded gas on the road. I mean, there are specific foods, supplements, and cosmetics that are contaminated with lead, and I have videos coming up on all those topics. But for most adults, the source of ongoing lead exposure is from our own skeleton. Remember how I said lead only lasts around about a month? Well, where does it go? It can get deposited in our bones. More than 90% of the total body lead content resides in the bone. where the half-life is not a month, but can be decades long. So half or more of the lead in our blood represents lead from past exposures just now leaching out of our bones back into our bloodstream. And it is this gradual release of lead from the bone that can serve as a persistent source of toxicity long after leaded gas was removed from the pumps for those of us who were around back before the 80s. So the question to where is the lead coming from is like Pogo's "We've met the enemy and he is us," or like that horror movie, "The call is coming from inside the house." The amount of lead in your bones can actually be measured, and higher levels are associated with some of our leading causes of death and disability, from tooth decay and miscarriages to cognitive decline and cataracts. Much of the lead found in adults today was deposited decades ago. Thus, regulations enacted in the 1970s may have been too late for many of us. But at least things are going in the right direction now. The dramatic societal decreases in blood lead in the U.S. since the 1970s have been associated with a 4 to 5 point increase in the average IQs of American adults. Particularly provocative question, then, is whether the whole country suffered brain damage prior to the 1980 decreases in blood lead. Was the best generation really the brain-damaged generation? There are certain nutrients whose intake has been associated with lower lead levels in the body. For example, women with higher thiamine intake, vitamin B1 intake, tended to have lower blood levels, the same with lead-exposed steelworkers. Fiber and iron intake were also associated with lower lead levels in the body to a lesser degree. The thinking is that the fiber might glom onto the lead and flush it out of the body, and the iron would inhibit the lead absorption, whereas the thiamine may accelerate lead removal through the bile. Thus, they suggest eating lots of iron, fiber, and especially thiamine-rich foods may induce rapid removal and excretion of lead from the tissues. But thiamine's never been put to the test, where you give people thiamine and see if their lead levels drop. The closest I could find is a thiamine intervention for lead-intoxicated goats. And much of the fiber data is just from test tube studies like this, where under simulated intestinal conditions, complete with flasks of feces, both soluble and insoluble dietary fiber were able to bind up large amounts of mercury, cadmium, and lead to such an extent that it may be able to block absorption in the small intestine, though when our good gut flora then eat the fiber, some of the heavy metals may be re-released down in the colon, so it's not completely fail-safe. And like thiamine, there haven't been controlled human studies. But look, where's thiamine found? Here are some of the healthiest sources that also contain fiber, concentrated, super healthy foods like beans and greens that we should all be eating anyway. So even if thiamine and fiber-rich foods don't actually lower your lead levels, you'd still end up healthier. Iron was put to the test, though, and it failed to improve the cognitive performance of lead-exposed children, failed to improve behavior or ADH symptoms. No surprise, because it failed to bring down lead levels, as did zinc supplementation. Turns out that while iron may limit the absorption of lead, it may also inhibit the excretion of lead that's already in your body. And iron may not even inhibit lead absorption in the first place. That was based on rodent studies, and it turns out we're not rodents. Same story with zinc. It may help to protect rat testicles, but didn't seem to help children. Nevertheless, iron is routinely prescribed in children with lead poisoning. Given the lack of scientific evidence supporting the use of indiscriminate iron supplementation in children with lead poisoning, its routine use should be re-examined. though obviously if you have iron deficiency, supplementation may help. High fat intake has been identified as something that may make things worse for lead-exposed children. Dietary fat has been associated with higher lead levels in cross-sectional snapshot-in-time type studies, and there is a plausible biological mechanism. Dietary fat may boost lead absorption by stimulating extra bile, which in turn may contribute to lead absorption, but you really don't know until you put it to the test. In addition to testing iron, they also tested fat. They gave a group of intrepid volunteers a cocktail of radioactive lead. Then with like a Geiger counter, they could measure how much radiation they retained in their body. Drinking the lead with iron or zinc didn't change anything. But adding about 2 teaspoons of vegetable oil boosted lead absorption into the body from about 60% up to around 75%. The only thing that seemed to help dropping lead absorption down to about 40% was eating a light meal with the lead drink. What was the meal? Coffee and a donut. I think this is the first donut intervention I've ever seen with a positive outcome. Could it have been the coffee? Unlikely, as if anything, coffee drinking has been associated with a tiny increase in blood levels. Wait a second, if fat makes things worse, and the one sugar they tried didn't help, they figured it was just eating food, any food, not taking in lead on an empty stomach that made the difference. And indeed, if you repeat the study with a whole meal, lead absorption doesn't just drop from 60 down to 40%, but all the way down to just 4%. That's extraordinary. That means it's 15 times worse to ingest lead on an empty stomach. The same amount of lead given 12 hours before a meal is absorbed at about 60%, so most of the lead is absorbed. 3 hours after a meal, most lead is absorbed. 7 hours after a meal, most lead is absorbed. But get some food in your stomach within a few hours of lead exposure, and you can suppress the absorption of some or nearly all of the lead you ingested. That's why it's critical to get the lead out of our tap water. Now, it's estimated that most of our lead exposure comes from food rather than water, but it's not what we eat, it's what we absorb. If 90% of the lead in food is blocked from absorption by the very fact that it's in food, you could get 10 to 20 times more lead absorbed into your bloodstream consuming the same amount of lead in water drunk on an empty stomach. And since children empty their stomachs faster than adults, meal timing may be even more important. With little tummies emptying in as few as 2 hours after a meal, offering mid-morning and mid-afternoon snacks in addition to breakfast and regular meals may cut down on absorption in a contaminated environment, making sure also, of course, that children are washing their hands prior to eating. So do preschoolers who eat breakfast have lower levels of lead in their blood? In the first study of its kind, researchers found that, indeed, children who ate breakfast regularly did appear to have lower lead levels, supporting recommendations to provide regular meals and snacks to young children at risk for lead exposure. Anything in food that's particularly protective? Researchers tested all sorts of foods to find out, and it turns out that the meal effect was probably largely due to its content of calcium and phosphate salts, but lead uptake was probably further reduced by phytate, which is plentiful in whole grains. Now, if calcium and phosphates are protective, you'd think dairy would work wonders. And indeed, they started giving milk to lead workers ever since calcium was shown to inhibit lead absorption in rats. But in humans, there's something in milk that appears to increase lead uptake. It wasn't the fat, since they found the same problem with skim milk. For over a century, milk was recommended unreservedly to counteract lead poisoning, but started to be abandoned in the middle of the last century, once we learned that the overall effect of milk may have been to actually promote the absorption of lead from the intestinal tract. What's the agent in milk that promotes the absorption of lead from the gut? It may be the milk sugar lactose, though the mechanism by which lactose enhances lead absorption is not clear. Bottom line is that while in the past milk was used as a prophylactic agent to protect workers in the lead industry, recent studies suggest that this practice is unjustified and may even be harmful. So maybe giving people whole grains may offer greater protection against lead uptake, though the most potently calcium and phytate-rich food would be tofu. Isolated soy phytonutrients may have a neuroprotective effect, at least in Petri dish-type studies, where if you add a little lead to nerve cells, you kill off about 40% of them. But then if you add more and more soy phytonutrients, you can ameliorate some of the damage. This is thought to be an antioxidant effect. If you add lead to nerve cells, you get a big burst of free radicals, but less and less as you drip more and more soy compounds. OK, but even if this worked outside of a lab, cutting down on the toxic effects of lead is nice, but cutting down on the levels of lead in your body is even better. Because tofu tends to have a high content of both calcium and phytate, it's plausible that tofu may inhibit lead absorption and retention, thus reducing blood lead levels, but you don't know until you put it to the test. Tofu consumption and blood lead levels were determined for about 1,000 men and women in China, and for every 9 or so ounces of tofu consumed a week, there appeared to be about 4% less lead in their bloodstream, compared to those eating less than about 9 ounces a week. Those that ate up to 2.5 ounces a day only had half the odds of having elevated lead levels, and those consuming nearly 4 ounces a day appeared to cut their odds by more than 80%. Now, this was just a cross-sectional study, snapshot in time, so it can't prove cause and effect. What you need is an interventional study where you randomize people into 2 groups, give half of them some food, and see if it drives lead levels down. There are so-called chelation drugs you can give for acute life-threatening lead poisoning, like if your 2-year-old swallows a little lead weight because Grandma was sewing curtains, and your doctor happens to miss it on X-ray, and so it sat there until she died with a blood lead level over 200. But for lower-grade, chronic lead poisoning, like levels under 45, there was no clear guidance as to whether these chelation drugs were effective, so they were put to the test. And they failed to bring down lead levels long-term. Even when they worked initially, and dose after dose, the lead continued to apparently seep from their bones, and by the end of the year they ended up with the same lead levels as the sugar pill group. So no surprise that even though blood levels dipped at the beginning, no improvements in cognitive function or development could be found. Since much of lead poisoning is preventable, and the drugs don't seem to work in most cases, that just underscores the need to protect children from exposure to lead in the first place. Despite the medical profession's best intentions to do something to help these kids, drug therapy is not the answer. Yeah, we need to redouble efforts to prevent lead poisoning in the first place, but what can we do for the kids who've already been exposed? The currently approved method, these chelating agents, which bind and remove lead from our tissues, lack safety and efficacy when these conventional chelating agents are used. So what about dietary approaches? See, plants produce phytochelatins. All higher plants possess the capacity to synthesize compounds that bind up heavy metals to protect themselves from the harmful effects, so what if we ate the plants? Unlike other forms of treatment, like pharmacotherapy with drugs, nutritional strategies carry the promise of a natural form of therapy that would presumably be cheap and with few or no side effects. Yeah, but would it work? I mean, the drugs didn't. We learned that a meal could considerably cut down on lead absorption, but the particular components of food intake that so dramatically reduced lead absorption was uncertain at the time. The calcium content of the meal appeared to be part of it, but milk didn't seem to help or even made things worse. So how about calcium supplements? There are those that assert calcium supplements may help, but recommendations must be based on evidence rather than conviction. And those assertions are in part based on studies on rodents, and differences in calcium absorption and balance between rats and humans make extrapolation tricky. What you have to do is put it to the test. And even an extra whopping 1,800 milligrams a day of calcium had no effect on blood lead levels. So the evidence does not support calcium supplements helping. What about whole foods? Reviews of dietary strategies to treat lead toxicity say things like eat lots of tomatoes, and berries, and onions, and garlic, and grapes as their natural antagonists to lead toxicity, and therefore should be consumed on a regular basis. Remember those phytochelatins? So maybe eating plants might help detoxify the lead in our own bodies, or those we eat. Maybe we could feed tomatoes, berries, onions, garlic, grapes to cows, pigs, chickens, and fish, and reduce our lead exposure that way. These natural phytochelatin compounds work so well that we can use them to clean up pollution. For example, chlorella can suck up lead and hold on to it, so what if we ate it? If it can clean up polluted bodies of water, might it clean up our own polluted bodies? We don't know, because all we have are studies like this, of mice, not men. So when you hear about how chlorella is detoxifying, they're talking about the detoxification of rat testicles. So yeah, a little sprinkle of chlorella might help your pet rat, or some black cumin seeds, or a sprig of cilantro. But when you hear about how cilantro is detoxifying against heavy metals, I presume you don't expect them to be talking about studies like this. But if we're interested in science and protecting our children, not just their pets, we're out of luck. Same with moringa. Same with tomatoes, and flaxseed oil, and sesame seed oil. Same with black grapes, and black, white, green, and red tea. There are simply no human studies to guide us. Dietary strategies for the treatment of lead toxicity are typically just based on studies on rats, mice, rats, 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 rats. But there are some human studies, promising human studies, Dietary strategies for the treatment of lead toxicity are often based on rodent studies. However, for tofu at least, there was a population study of people showing lower lead levels in men and women who ate more tofu. They controlled for a whole bunch of factors, so it's not like tofu lovers were protected just because they smoked less or ate less meat, but you can't control for everything. Ideally, what we'd have is a randomized, placebo-controlled study. Take a group of people exposed to lead, split them up into two groups, half get the food, half get some kind of identical placebo food, and see what happens. Easy to do with drugs. You can just use look-alike sugar pills as placebos, so people don't know what group they're in. But how do you make placebo food? One way to do disguised food interventions is to use foods that are so potent they can be stuffed in a pill, like garlic. There had been various studies on the effects of garlic in rats, and as a potential antidote for lead intoxication distributed among different mouse organs, but who eats mouse organs? This animal study had some direct human relevance, though, the effect of garlic on lead contents in chicken tissues. To explore the possible uses of garlic to clean up lead contents in chickens, which, like all of us on planet Earth, have been exposed to lead pollution, in hopes we can minimize the hazard of lead-polluted chicken meat. And it worked! Feeding garlic to chickens reduces lead levels in the edible mass of the chicken by up to 75% or more. Even if you don't give them lead, raise them on distilled water, they end up with some lead in their meat and giblets. We just live in such a polluted world. But actively feed them lead for a week, and the levels get really high. But give them the same amount of lead with a little garlic added, give them some garlicky lead, and much less lead accumulates in their bodies. OK, but here's the crazy part. Same amount of lead, but this time you wait a week, and then give the garlic, and it worked even better. The value of garlic in reducing lead concentrations was more pronounced when given afterwards, after the lead was stopped, after the lead had already built up in the tissue. So, see, we used to think that the beneficial effects of garlic against lead toxicity was primarily due to a reaction between lead and sulfur compounds in the garlic that would glom onto the lead in the intestinal tract and flush it out of the body. But what this study showed is that garlic appears to contain compounds that can actually pull lead, not just out of the intestinal contents, but out of the tissues of the body. So the results indicate that garlic contains chelating compounds capable of enhancing elimination of lead. So garlic feeding can be exploited to safeguard human consumers by minimizing lead concentrations in meat. But if garlic is so effective at pulling lead out of chickens' bodies, why not exploit garlic feeding more directly by eating it ourselves? Well, there had never been a study on the ability of garlic to help lead-exposed humans until now. Actually, I'm embarrassed to say, the study was published back in 2012, but I missed it. That was when I was just setting up nutritionfacts.org, getting it up and running. Now that we have a staff and whole research team, hopefully important studies like this won't slip through the cracks in the future. But here we go, a head-to-head comparison of the therapeutic effects of garlic versus a chelation therapy drug called D-penicillamine. 117 workers exposed to lead in the car battery industry were randomly assigned into one of two groups, the drug 3 times a day, or an eighth of a teaspoon of garlic powder compressed into a tablet 3 times a day. That's about the equivalent of 2 cloves of fresh garlic a day, for a month. As expected, the chelation drug reduced blood lead levels by about 20%. But so did the garlic. The garlic worked just as well as the drug, and of course had fewer side effects. Thus, garlic seems safer and as effective, but saying something is as effective as chelation therapy isn't saying much. Remember how, for chronic lead poisoning, chelation drugs can lower blood levels, but don't actually improve neurological function? OK, are you ready? This is where it gets amazing. Significant clinical improvements were seen in the garlic group, less irritability, fewer headaches, improvements in their reflexes and blood pressure after treatment with garlic, but not the drug. So garlic was safer and more effective. Therefore, garlic can be recommended for the treatment of mild to moderate lead poisoning. Even if a nutritional manipulation is proven effective in reducing blood lead levels, a reliance on such an intervention places most of the burden for prevention on those most affected and least responsible for the underlying environmental causes. Nutritional interventions, therefore, must never substitute for efforts to reduce lead exposure to safer levels. On the other hand, when used as an adjunct, some nutritional changes may prove to have benefits beyond lead toxicity. For example, vitamin C-rich foods may help with a bunch of things, in addition to perhaps influencing lead toxicity through an effect on absorption of lead, elimination of lead, transport within the body, tissue binding, or just helping ameliorate some of the damage. But based on what? Well, in 1939, a remarkable study was published entitled Vitamin C Treatment in Lead Poisoning, in which 17 lead workers were given 100 milligrams of vitamin C a day, the amount found in 1 or 2 oranges, and with practically all of them there was a marked gain in vigor, color of skin, cheerfulness, their blood, appetite, and ability to sleep. Now, they were chosen because they seemed in pretty bad shape, maybe even had scurvy, so no wonder a little vitamin C helped. But vitamin C is an antioxidant, and oxidation is an important mechanism underlying lead toxicity, so it's conceivable that it may have mediated some of the harm. But the vitamin C didn't appear to just reduce the damage from the lead, but reduce the lead itself. This is the amount of lead a painter was peeing out over a month after starting 200 milligrams of vitamin C a day, a 5-fold drop, suggesting he was absorbing less of the lead into his body. And he was one of 3 painters they tried it on, and evidently all their levels dropped. The researchers concluded that those exposed to lead should be advised to include in their diet plenty of vitamin C-rich foods such as tomatoes, citrus, spinach, turnips, bell peppers, cantaloupe, etc. Now, this was just 3 painters, and they didn't have a control group of painters that didn't take vitamin C, so maybe everyone's lead levels would have dropped regardless for some reason, and it was just a coincidence. You don't know until you put it to the test. That original data was so compelling that it inspired others to try to replicate them. If it actually worked, they could start handing out grapefruits at the factory door. The earlier study didn't have a good control group, but they weren't going to make that same mistake this time. Half the group got 100 milligrams of vitamin C a day, not just for a month, but for a year. And the other group got nothing, and careful study of the group failed to reveal any effect of vitamin C on the lead concentration in their blood or urine, no difference in their physical condition, no changes in their blood work, and so no reason for recommending the use of vitamin C to minimize effects of lead absorption. Bummer. It looks so promising. Whenever I study a topic, I try to read the research chronologically so as to kind of experience the discoveries as they happened throughout history, but I was so tempted at this point to just jump to a recent review to see what had happened in the intervening 74 years since this was published, but I didn't want to spoiler alert myself. There were in vitro studies where they dripped antioxidants on lead-exposed cells, and it seemed to help, and so they jumped on the cantaloupe bandwagon too, but these were like test tube studies. The first population study was published in 1999, and they did find that those with high vitamin C levels in their blood tended to have lower lead levels. Youths with the highest vitamin C levels had a nearly 90% lower prevalence of having elevated blood lead levels compared to those with the lowest C. Now, this was a cross-sectional study, just a snapshot in time, so we don't know if the vitamin C caused a drop in lead. Maybe the lead caused a drop in vitamin C. Lead is a pro-oxidant, so maybe it just ate up the vitamin C. And hey, who has higher vitamin C levels? Those who can afford to have higher vitamin C levels, those who eat lots of fruits and vegetables. Maybe the lower vitamin C levels was just a proxy for being poor, and that's the real reason for their higher lead levels. Look, there's lots of good reasons to be eating more fruits and vegetables, and we should be eating more spinach regardless, but it'd be nice to know if it actually helps with lead poisoning or not. To know that, we need to put it to the test. Unfortunately, most of the published interventions are like this. What are the effects of dietary vitamin C supplementation on lead-treated sea cucumbers? Well, that's not very helpful. And there's a surprising number of articles on the effects of C supplementation on mouse testicles. but that's because lead may impair male fertility. Lead workers appear to have a reduced likelihood of fathering children. This may in part be due to oxidative stress, so how about giving an antioxidant like vitamin C and putting it to the testes? No, not rat testes. No, not frog testes. No, not crab testes. I didn't even know crabs had testicles. Here we go. The clinical relevance of vitamin C among lead-exposed infertile men. Human men. What is the clinical relevance of vitamin C among lead-exposed infertile men? Compared to controls, lead battery industry workers given 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C every workday for 3 months experienced a significant increase in sperm motility and sperm count, as well as a decrease in abnormal sperms, as well as a significant reduction in the incidence of damaged DNA. OK, but the ideal endpoint would be bouncing baby boys and girls. Enter this extraordinary little study from the University of Texas from over 30 years ago. 27 men with fertile wives, yet trying to have kids for years to no avail. 20 of them were given 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C a day for 2 months, and 7 act as controls, no vitamin C. They followed up at the end of 60 days, and by then, every single one of the 20 women became pregnant. 20 out of 20. Years of frustration, and then boom, 100% pregnant. And not a single one of the women in the control group got pregnant. Rarely does one see these kind of black and white results in the medical literature for any intervention. Is the vitamin C just lowering the oxidative stress from the lead, or actually lowering the level of lead? Sure, antioxidant supplementation can have antioxidant effects, but may fail to actually lower lead levels in the blood. Now, this was in a group of lead workers that were breathing the stuff day in, day out, and the way vitamin C may work is to just block the intestinal absorption of lead. An earlier study showed vitamin C supplementation apparently cut lead levels by 1/3 within 6 months, but that was with a whopping 2-gram dose with added zinc. Another small study found the same 30% drop with just 500 milligrams a day, no zinc, and in only 1 month. But neither of these studies had a control group that didn't take anything, so you don't know if maybe their levels would have fallen anyway. It's like this almost too good to be true study on the role of vitamin C in scavenging lead toxicity from biosystems, by which they meant children. 250 to 500 milligrams a day of vitamin C for a few months, shaving hair samples every month, and saw up to a 69% decline in lead levels. So they repeated it in 2 other small groups of kids, and saw the same amazing kind of drops in every single child. But maybe lead levels were just dropping throughout the whole community during that time? Without measuring lead levels in a control group of kids not taking vitamin C, we can't be sure. Here's a good study to illustrate. 8 weeks of vitamin C and lead levels dropped in the blood and rose in the urine. So one could conclude that the vitamin C was like pulling lead out of the body. But the same things happened in the placebo group. Blood levels dropped and urine levels rose. So it had nothing to do with the vitamin C at all. That's why it's always important to have a control group. The same with studies that appeared to show no benefit. 36 battery workers all given vitamin C, no change in their lead levels. But maybe their co-workers during that same time period suffered a big increase in lead levels, and the vitamin C was actually successful in keeping lead levels from rising. You don't know without a control group. That's why studies like this are so important. Vitamin C or placebo. Vitamin C versus an identical-looking sugar pill. And the vitamin C failed to help. That really put a damper on enthusiasm for using vitamin C for lead poisoning until This now famous study was published in 1999 that showed that vitamin C supplementation could lead to a decrease in blood levels. But check this out. Here's where the control group started, and after 4 weeks of taking a placebo, pretty much nothing happened, which is what you'd expect. Okay, but check out the vitamin C group. Started out at about the same, but within 1 week of taking 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C a day, lead levels dropped 81%. So vitamin C supplementation may provide an economical and convenient method of reducing blood lead levels, possibly by reducing the intestinal absorption of lead. See, the urine lead levels didn't change, so it's not like they were peeing out more lead to bring down their blood levels. But most of the lead in our blood is in the red blood cells, which are recycled in the liver and discharged through the bile into the gut, where the lead could just get reabsorbed, unless perhaps you got a lot of vitamin C in there to block the reabsorption. But 1,000 milligrams is a lot of vitamin C. Would something like 200 milligrams work, which is just like an orange and a couple broccoli or strawberries? They tested that too. The 200 milligram group started out about the same and didn't really budge. Bummer. So 1,000 seemed to work, but 200 didn't. Isn't 1,000 a bit unnatural, though? I mean, the RDA is only 60. Well, actually, we may have evolved for millions of years getting closer to 600 milligrams a day, 10 times the current RDA, because we were shoveling in so many fruits and greens. Yeah, but could you reach 1,000 milligrams without having to take pills? Sure, that's the amount of vitamin C, for example, that can be found in 3 bell peppers. Nearly 20% of cancers can be linked to infectious agents such as viruses. There are 7 viruses now conclusively tied to human cancers. And as new viruses enter into human populations, the incidence and causes of cancer will likely change accordingly. The foundation of modern tumor virology was laid over a century ago with the discovery of a cancer-causing chicken virus, for which a Nobel Prize was awarded. Another Nobel went to the guy that discovered the HPV virus was causing cervical cancer, and in his acceptance speech, he mused that there may be a bovine polyoma virus, a multiple tumor virus in cattle that could be playing a role in human colon cancer, lung cancer, and breast cancer, but no polyoma virus had ever been discovered in meat until now. Polyoma viruses are a particular concern, not only because they are known to be carcinogenic, but because they can survive cooking temperatures. Because single burgers these days can contain meat from many dozens of animals, they figured it would present an ideal situation for virus hunting. So researchers at the National Cancer Institute just walked into 3 supermarkets and grabbed meat right off the shelf, and found 3 different polyoma viruses in ground beef. Now, just because 3 types of polyoma viruses are commonly detectable in food-grade ground beef doesn't necessarily mean they're causing human disease. What made this Nobel laureate suspect them? Well, for one thing, some people got cancer right where they were vaccinated for smallpox. A whole bunch of different cancers. The vaccine was harvested from the skin of calves, and so maybe there's some cancer-causing cow virus. Many people are exposed to potentially virus-contaminated meat and dairy products through their diet, but those in the industry would be even more exposed. So it would be interesting to see if these groups have higher cancer incidence, and indeed it now appears clear that those who work in the meat industry are at increased risk of developing and dying from a variety of cancers. Another reason to suspect the involvement of some kind of bovine infectious factor in colorectal cancer is the fact that countries that don't eat a lot of beef appear to have relatively low rates of colorectal cancer, and countries that all of a sudden started eating lots of meat had their rates shoot up. Mongolia appears to be the exception. Lots of red meat, yet low colon cancer rates, but there they eat yak, and maybe yaks don't harbor the same viruses. Can't you just avoid steak tartare? Even steak cooked medium may not reach internal temperatures above 70 Celsius, and it takes temperatures above that to inactivate some of these viruses. So we would expect viruses to survive both cooking and pasteurization. In fact, they followed up with a paper suggesting that consumption of dairy products may represent a main risk factor for the development of human breast cancer. The recent discovery of a larger number of presumably new viruses in the blood, meat, and milk of dairy cows should be investigated, since one might speculate that infectious agents present in dairy products might have a special affinity for breast cells, since they came from breast cells. The fact that people with lactose intolerance, who tend to avoid milk and dairy throughout their lives, have lower rates of breast cancer and other cancers could be seen as supporting this concept. Though there are certainly other reasons dairy may increase cancer risks, such as increasing levels of the cancer-promoting growth hormone IGF-1, or adversely affecting our gut microbiome, or for that matter, maybe the plant-based milks they're drinking instead could be protective. That's the problem with population studies. You can't tease out cause and effect. It doesn't matter how many viruses are found in retail beef, pork, and chicken if we can't connect the dots. Can't you just look for the presence of these viruses within human tumors? They've tried and found some, but even if you don't find any, that doesn't necessarily mean viruses didn't play a role. There's this viral hit-and-run theory of cancer development that suggests that certain viruses can slip in and out of our DNA to initiate the cancer, but be long gone by the time the tumor matures. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But if the link between bovine polyomaviruses and human disease pans out, the National Cancer Institute researchers envision the development of a high-potency vaccine. So just like the HPV vaccine may prevent cervical cancer from unsafe sex, one day, perhaps, vaccines may prevent breast and colon cancer from unsafe sirloin. Good bacteria, those that live in symbiosis with us, are nourished by fruits and veggies, grains and beans, whereas dysbiosis, bad bacteria that may contribute to disease, are fed by meat, junk food, and fast food, seafood, dairy, and eggs. Typical Western diets can decimate our good gut flora. We live with trillions of symbionts, good bacteria that live in symbiosis with us. We help them, they help us. And a month on a plant-based diet results in an increase of the good guys, and a decrease in the bad, the so-called pathobionts, the disease-causing bugs. Given the disappearance of pathobionts from the intestine, one would expect to observe a reduction in intestinal inflammation. So they measured stool concentrations of lipocolin-2, which is a sensitive biomarker of intestinal inflammation, and within a month of eating healthy, it had declined significantly, suggesting that promotion of microbial homeostasis, or balance, by a strict vegetarian diet resulted in reduced intestinal inflammation. And this rebalancing may have played a role in the improved metabolic and immune system parameters. On an animal-based diet, you get growth of disease-associated species like Bilophila wadsworthia, associated with inflammatory bowel disease, and A. putridinus, found in abscesses and appendicitis, and a decrease in fiber-eating bacteria. Eat fiber, and the fiber-munching bacteria multiply, and we get more anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, short-chain fatty acids. Eat less fiber, and our fiber-eating bacteria starve away. They are what we eat. Eat a lot of phytates, and your gut flora get really good at breaking down phytates. We assumed this was just because we were naturally selecting for those populations of bacteria that could do that, but it turns out our diet can teach old bugs new tricks. There's one type of fiber in nori seaweed that our gut bacteria can't normally break down, but the bacteria out in the ocean that eat seaweed have an enzyme to do so. When it was discovered that the enzyme was present in the guts of Japanese people, it presented a mystery. Sure, sushi is eaten raw, and so some seaweed bacteria may have made it into their colons, but how could some marine bacteria thrive in the human gut? It didn't need to. It transferred the nori-eating enzyme to our own gut bacteria. Consequently, the consumption of food with associated environmental bacteria is the most likely mechanism that promoted the enzyme update into our own gut microbes, almost like a software update. We have the same hardware, the same gut bacteria, but they just updated their software to chew on something new. Hardware can change too, though. The reason this is called the way to a man's heart is through his gut microbiota is because they were talking about TMAO. Certain gut flora can take carnitine from the red meat we eat, or the choline concentrated in dairy and seafood and eggs, and convert it into a toxic compound, which may lead to an increase in our risk of heart attack, stroke, and death. This explains why those eating more plant-based diets have lower blood concentrations of the stuff, but they also produce less of the toxin, even if you feed them a steak. You don't see the same conversion, suggesting an adaptive response of the gut microbiota in omnivores. They are what we feed them. It's like if you give people cyclamate, a synthetic artificial sweetener. Most of our bacteria don't know what to do with it, but if you feed it to people for 10 days and select for the few bacteria that were hip to the new synthetic chemical, eventually 3/4 of the cyclamate you eat is metabolized by the bacteria into another new compound called cyclohexylamine. But stop eating it, and those bacteria die back. Unfortunately, cyclohexylamine may be toxic, and so was banned by the FDA in 1969, whereas regular Kool-Aid evidently is completely safe. But if you just ate cyclamate once in a while, it wouldn't turn into cyclohexylamide, because you wouldn't have fed and fostered the gut flora specialized to do so. And the same with TMAO. Those that just eat red meat or eggs or seafood once in a while would presumably make very little of the toxin because they hadn't been cultivating the bacteria that produces it. Improving cognitive performance with aromatherapy in young, healthy volunteers is one thing, but how about where it really matters? This group of Japanese researchers had this pie-in-the-sky notion that maybe certain smells could lead to nerve rebirth in Alzheimer's patients. 20 years ago, to even raise such a possibility as a hypothetical was heretical. Everybody knew that the loss of neurons is irreversible. In other words, dead nerve cells are not replaced. An important factor in neurodegenerative diseases. That's what I was taught, that's what everyone was taught, until 1998. Patients with advanced cancer volunteered to be injected with a special dye that's incorporated into the DNA of new cells. On autopsy, the researchers then went hunting for nerve cells in the brain that lit up. And there they were, new nerve cells in the brain that didn't exist just days or months before, demonstrating that cell genesis occurs in human brains, and the human brain retains the potential for self-renewal throughout life, something we can take comfort in. Still doesn't mean smells can help, but an aromatherapy regimen of rosemary, lemon, lavender, and orange was attempted for a month. Here's the trajectory of their ability to form abstract ideas, and their cognitive function starting 6 weeks before the treatment, showing a rather steady decline until they reversed after the aromatherapy. The researchers conclude aromatherapy may be efficacious and have some potential for improving cognitive function. All, of course, without any apparent side effects. What about severe dementia? We always hear about the cognitive deficits, but more than half of patients with dementia experience behavioral or psychiatric symptoms. Thorazine-type antipsychotic drugs are often prescribed, even though they appear to be particularly dangerous in the elderly. But hey, it's easier to just prescribe a drug than offer non-pharmacological alternatives, such as aromatherapy, rubbing a lemon balm-infused lotion on their arms and face twice daily, compared to a lotion without the scent. Everybody got rubbed, but in the lemon balm group, significant improvements in agitation, shouting, screaming, and physical aggression, and improved quality of life indicators, less socially withdrawn, more engagement in constructive activities. That's important because when you give the antipsychotics, patients become more withdrawn, less engaged. It's like a chemical restraint. Yeah, the drugs can reduce agitation too, but that may just be because you're effectively knocking the person out. So, aromatherapy with lemon balm is safe, well-tolerated, highly efficacious, with additional benefits on key quality-of-life parameters. These findings clearly indicate the need for longer-term multi-center trials, but we never had any until never. We still don't have any. The study was back in 2002, and still nothing. But is that a surprise? Who's going to fund such a study? Big Balm? Which plant should we give for which skin disease? There have been thousands of studies published to date about the health effects of green tea, but it wasn't until fairly recently that researchers have begun to look at the possibility of using green tea for the prevention and treatment of infections. Patents have been taken out on the antibacterial, antifungal, and antiviral properties of tea. Let's review some of the evidence. In terms of fungal infections, green tea compounds demonstrated potent antifungal activity against the primary cause of athlete's foot, fungal nail infections, jock itch, and ringworm, comparable in some cases to powerful antifungal drugs like fluconazole. OK, but this is in a petri dish. How about a green tea foot bath for athlete's foot fungus between the toes? Evidently, tea leaves were once used as a folk remedy for the fungus, so why not put it to the test? And indeed, a once-a-day, 15-minute dilute green tea foot bath led to a significant improvement in symptoms compared to control. Green tea baths also appeared to help with fungus-associated atopic dermatitis, though there was no control group. And full-strength green tea may help clear candida yeast from poorly cleaned dentures. How about for the bacteria that cause plaque and gingivitis? Even a 2% green tea mouthwash was found to be effective. Yes, you should be able to control plaque just with proper brushing and flossing, but with an emphasis on proper. Most people don't brush the recommended 4 minutes a day, and so a dilute green tea mouthwash may help. Now, in terms of strictly plaque bacteria killing ability, green tea got beat out by a garlic with lime mouth rinse, but I think I'll just stick with the green tea, thank you very much. Ew. Especially when green tea appears to not just kill plaque bugs directly, but also boost the antibacterial capacity of saliva after you drink it. What about green tea for acne? 6 weeks of a 2% green tea lotion cut the number of pimples more than half, and significantly reduced the severity, making it a cheap, effective treatment for acne. Impetigo is another bacterial skin infection that can affect the face, but a tea ointment can affect an 80% cure rate, on par with antibiotics given topically or orally. What about bladder infections? We know a certain concentration of green tea compounds can kill the type of E. coli that causes urinary tract infections. The question then becomes, how much tea do you have to drink to achieve those concentrations in your bladder? And it turns out, not much. Just 1 cup of tea might have an effect, but you might have to space out multiple cups over the day, since it gets cleared out of your system within about 8 hours. So where we stand now, the test tube data looks good, but there is yet to be a single study to put it to the test, so should at this point just be used as an adjunct therapy for bladder infections. But with emerging multi-drug-resistant organisms, green tea certainly holds potential. Wait a second, though. If it's so good at killing bacteria, if we drink green tea, might we be killing the good bacteria in our gut? No, that's the amazing thing. A great advantage against other bacteria-killing agents. No effect on our intestinal flora. But that may actually not be true. Drinking green tea may actually boost the levels of our good bacteria by acting as a prebiotic, and thereby improve the colon environment. In 1993, the Harvard Nurse study found that the high intake of trans fats may increase the risk of heart disease by 50%. That's where the trans fat story started in Denmark, ending a decade later with a ban on added trans fats there in 2003. It took another 10 years, though, before the U.S. even started considering a ban. All the while, trans fats were killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. Why, if so many people were dying, did it take so long for the U.S. to suggest taking action? One can look at the fight over New York City's trans fat ban for a microcosm of the national debate. Opposition came, not surprisingly, from the food industry, complaining about government intrusion, likening the city to a nanny state. Are trans fat bans the road to food fascism? Yes, a ban on added trans fats might save 50,000 American lives every year, which might save the country tens of billions of dollars in healthcare costs. Not so fast, though. If people eating trans fat die early, think how much we could save on Medicare and Social Security. That's why smokers may actually cost society less than non-smokers, because smokers die earlier. So we should be careful about making claims about the potential cost savings of trans fat bans. More research is needed on the effects of these policies. Yes, we might save 50,000 lives a year, but you have to think about the effects on the food industry. How about just education and product labeling, rather than the quote-unquote extreme measure of banning trans fats? As the leading Danish cardiologist put it, when we discover a food additive that's dangerous, we don't label it, we simply remove it. But we're Americans. As they say in North America, you can put poison in food if you label it properly. But look, People who are informed and know the risks should be able to eat whatever they want. But that's assuming they're given all the facts, which doesn't always happen due to deception and manipulation by the food industry. And not surprisingly, it's the unhealthiest of foods that are most commonly promoted using deceptive marketing. It's not because junk food companies are evil or want to make us sick. The reason is one of simple economics. Processed foods simply offer higher profit margins and are shelf-stable, unlike fresh foods such as fruits and vegetables. So their model of systemic dishonesty, some argue, justifies some minimal level of government intervention. But what about the slippery slope? Today trans fats, tomorrow hot dogs. Or the reverse, what if they make us eat broccoli? This actually came up in a Supreme Court case over Obamacare. As Chief Justice Roberts said, Congress could start ordering everyone to buy vegetables. A concerned Justice Ginsburg labeled the broccoli horrible. Hypothetically, Congress could compel the American public to go plant-based, yet one can't offer the hypothetical and unreal possibility of a vegetarian state as a credible argument. As one legal scholar put it, judges and lawyers may live on the slippery slope of analogies, but they're not supposed to ski it to the bottom. If anything, what about the slippery slope of inaction? Government initially defaulted to business interests in the case of tobacco, and pursued weak and ineffective attempts at education to try to counter all the tobacco industry lies. And look what happened. The unnecessary deaths could be counted in the millions. The U.S. can ill afford to repeat this mistake with diet. The years of healthy life lost due to our consumption of trans fats is comparable to the impact of conditions like meningitis, cervical cancer, and multiple sclerosis. But if food zealots get their wish in banning added trans fats, what's next? Vested corporate interests rally around these kinds of slippery slope arguments to distract from the fact that people are dying. New York Mayor Bloomberg was decried as a meddling nanny for his trans fat ban and attempt to cap soft drink sizes. How dare he try to manipulate consumer choice? But isn't that what the industry's done? In 1950, a 12-ounce soda was the king-sized option. Now that's like the kiddie size. Similarly, with trans fats, it was the industry that limited our choice by putting trans fats in everything without even telling us. So who's the nanny now? New York City finally won its trans fat fight, preserving its status as a public health leader. For example, it took decades to achieve a national prohibition of lead paint, despite unequivocal evidence for harm. But New York led the way, banning it 18 years before federal action. There's irony in the slippery slope argument that first they came for your fries, next they'll come for your burger. After the trans fat oil ban, one of the only sources of trans fat left will be in the meat itself. Trans fat naturally exists in small amounts in the fat in meat and milk, as I've talked about before. Animal products only used to provide about a fifth of America's trans fat intake, but since the U.S. trans fat ban exempts animal products, they will soon take over as the leading source. In Denmark, for example, now that added trans fats are banned, the only real trans fat exposure left is from animal products, found in U.S. dairy, beef, chicken fat, turkey meat, lunch meat, hot dogs, with trace amounts in vegetable oils due to the refining process. The question is, are animal trans fats as bad as processed food trans fats? A compilation of randomized interventional trials found that they both make bad cholesterol go up, they both make good cholesterol go down, and so they both make the ratio of bad to good go up, which is bad. So all trans fats cause negative effects irrespective of their origin. They suspect that removing natural trans fats from the diet, too, could prevent tens of thousands of heart attacks, but unlike processed foods, you can't remove trans fats from milk and meat because trans fats are there naturally. The livestock industry suggests a little bit of their trans fats might not be too bad, but you saw the same everything in moderation argument coming from the Institute of Shortening, after industrial trans fats were first exposed as a threat. The bottom line is that all sources of trans fat should probably be minimized. The trans fat in processed foods can be banned, and just adhering to the current dietary guidelines to restrict saturated fat intake, which is primarily found in meat and dairy as well, would kind of automatically cut trans fat intake from animal fats. The reason no progress may have been made on animal trans fat reduction in Denmark is because the Nutrition Council that pushed for the trans fat ban was a joint initiative of the Medical Association and the Dairy Board. They recognized that the economic support from the Dairy Council could be perceived as problematic from a scientific integrity point of view, but not to worry, the Medical Association expanded the board and funding members to include the Danish pork industry, the Danish meat industry, the Poultry and Egg Council, as well as Big Margarine. What's the latest on treating depression with the spice saffron? Years ago, I covered this head-to-head comparison of saffron versus Prozac for the treatment of depression. It seemed to work just as well, and in the years since, there's been 5 other studies that found that saffron beat out placebo or rivaled antidepressant medications. It may be the red pigment in the spice called crocin, since it alone beat out placebo as an adjunct treatment, significantly decreasing symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, and general psychological distress. Perhaps in its antioxidant role, preventing free radical-induced damage within the brain. The amount of crocin they used was equivalent to about a half teaspoon of saffron a day. If the spice works as well as the drugs, one could argue that the spice wins, since it doesn't cause sexual dysfunction in the majority of men and women like most prescribed antidepressants do, with drugs like Prozac, Paxil, and Zoloft causing adverse sexual side effects in about 70% of people taking them. Physicians not only significantly underestimate the occurrence of side effects, they tend to underrate how much they impact the lives of their patients. Not only is this not a problem with saffron, the spice may even be able to treat it. In folk medicine, there's a widely held belief that saffron might have aphrodisiac effects. So men with Prozac-induced sexual impairment were randomized to saffron or placebo for a month. And by week 4, saffron resulted in significantly greater improvements in erectile function and intercourse satisfaction. More than half of the men in the saffron group regained normal function. They conclude that saffron is an efficacious treatment for Prozac-related erectile dysfunction, and female sexual dysfunction as well. Female sexual function increased by week 4, improving some of the Prozac-induced sexual problems, but not others, so better perhaps to try saffron in the first place for the depression and avoid developing these problems, since sometimes they can persist even after stopping the drugs, potentially worsening one's long-term depression prognosis. This includes unusual side effects such as genital anesthesia, where you literally lose sensation. It can happen in men and women. More rarely, antidepressants can induce a condition called restless genital syndrome. You've heard of restless leg syndrome? Well, this is restless between the legs syndrome. These PSSDs, these post-SSRI sexual dysfunctions, meaning dysfunction that appear or persist after stopping taking these antidepressants, can be so serious that prescribing physicians should mention the danger of, for example, the risk of genital anesthesia for every patient prior to starting them on these drugs. If you're on one of these drugs, did your doctor warn you about that? All hope is not lost, though. Evidently, penile anesthesia responds to low-power laser irradiation. After 20 laser treatments to his penis, one man who lost his penile sensation thanks to the drug Paxil partially regained his touch and temperature sensation. However, he still couldn't perform to his girlfriend's satisfaction, and she ended up evidently leaving him over it, which probably didn't help his mood any. But before you feel too bad for him, compare a little penile light therapy to clitoridectomy, clitoris removal surgery. Or another Paxil-related case where a woman's symptoms only improved after 6 courses of electroshock therapy. About 5 years ago, Denmark introduced the world's first tax on saturated fat. After only 15 months, however, the fat tax was abolished due to massive pressure from farming and food company interests. Public health advocates are weak when it comes to tackling the issues of corporate power. One well-used approach for alcohol, tobacco, and now more food-related corporate interests is to shift the focus away from health. This involves reframing a fat or soft drinks tax as an issue of consumer rights and a debate over the role of the nanny state in restricting people's choices. The nanny state is typically used as a pejorative term to discourage governments from introducing legislation or regulation that might undermine the power or actions of industry or individuals, and has been regularly used to undermine public health efforts. But those complaining about the governmental manipulation of people's choices tend to hypocritically be fine with corporations doing the same thing. One could argue that public health is being undermined by nanny industry that uses fear of government regulation to maintain its own dominance and profits, and at significant cost to public health. The tobacco industry offers the classic example, touting personal responsibility, which has a certain philosophical appeal. Look, as long as people understand the risks, they should be free to do whatever they want with their bodies. Now, some argue risk-taking affects others, but if you have the right to put your own life at risk, shouldn't you have the right to aggrieve your parents, widow your spouse, orphan your children? Then there's the social cost argument, and people's bad decisions can cost the society as a whole, whose tax dollars may have to care for them, clean up the mess. Right? The independent individualist motorcyclist, helmetless and free on the open road, becomes the most dependent of individuals in the spinal injury ward. But for the sake of argument, let's forget these spillover effects, the so-called externalities. If someone understands the hazards, shouldn't they be able to do whatever they want? First of all, this assumes that people can access accurate and balanced information relevant to their decisions. But deliberate industry interference has often created situations where consumers have access only to incomplete and inaccurate information. For decades, tobacco companies successfully suppressed or undermined scientific evidence of smoking's dangers and downplayed the public health concerns. "Don't worry your little head," said the nanny companies. Decades of deception and manipulation, deliberate targeting of children, marketing and selling their lethal products with zeal and without regard for the unfolding human tragedy. So the tobacco industry's deliberate strategy of challenging scientific evidence undermines smokers' ability to understand the harms smoking poses, and so undermines the whole concept that smoking is a fully informed choice. Tobacco companies have denied smokers truthful information, yet at the same time hold smokers accountable for incurring diseases that will cause half of them to die prematurely. So in contexts such as these, government intervention may be vital to protect consumers from predatory industries. And is the food industry any different? The public is bombarded with information, and it's hard to tell which is true, which is false, and which is merely exaggerated. Foods are sold without clarity about the nutritional content or harmful effects. Remember how the food industry spent $1 billion making sure the easy-to-understand traffic light labeling system on food never saw the light of day, and was replaced by indecipherable this? That's 10 times more than the drug industry spends on lobbying in the U.S. It's in the food industry's interest to have the public confused about nutrition. How confused are we about nutrition? Head Start teachers are responsible for providing nutrition education to over 1 million low-income children every year. 181 Head Start teachers were put to the test, and only about 4 out of 181 answered at least 4 out of the 5 nutrition knowledge questions correctly. Most, for example, could not correctly answer the question, which has more calories, protein, carbohydrates, or fat. Not a single one could answer all 5 nutrition questions correctly. While they valued nutrition education, 54% agreed that it was hard to know which nutrition information to believe, and the food industry wants to keep it that way. A quarter of the teachers didn't consume any fruits or vegetables the previous day, though half did have French fries and a soda, and a quarter consumed fried meat the day before. Not surprisingly, 55% of the teachers were not just overweight, but obese. So when even the teachers are confused, something must be done. No purveyor of unhealthy products wants the public to know the truth. An incredible example comes from the U.S. Fairness Doctrine and the tobacco advertising experience in the 1960s. Before tobacco advertising was banned from television, a court ruling in 1967 required that tobacco companies funded 1 health ad about smoking for every 4 tobacco TV advertising they put on. Rather than face this corrective advertising, the tobacco industry took their own advertising off television. They knew they couldn't compete with the truth. Just the threat of corrective advertising, even on a 1-to-4 basis, was sufficient to make tobacco companies withdraw their own advertising. They needed to keep the public in the dark. If you took a drop of blood and smeared it between 2 pieces of glass and looked at it under a microscope, it might look something like this: a whole bunch of little round red blood cells, and then this big white blood cell. Red blood cells carry oxygen, and white blood cells are our immune system foot soldiers. We may churn out 50 billion new ones a day. In response to inflammation or infection, that number could shoot up to 100 billion or more. In fact, that's what pus is largely composed of, millions and millions of white blood cells. Testing how many white blood cells we have at any given time, our white blood cell count, is one of the most common laboratory tests doctors order. We order it hundreds of millions of times a year. So for example, if you end up in the emergency room with abdominal pain, having a white blood cell count above about 10 billion per quart of blood may be a sign you may have appendicitis. Most Americans fall between 4.5 and 10. But most Americans are unhealthy. Just because 4.5 to 10 is normal doesn't mean it's ideal. It's like having a normal cholesterol level in a society where it's normal to die of heart disease, our #1 killer. The average American is overweight, So if your weight is quote-unquote normal, that's actually a bad thing. In fact, having excess fat itself causes inflammation within the body, so no surprise those who are obese walk around with 2 billion more white cells per quart in their blood. So maybe obese individuals should have their own normal values. Someone with a 47-inch waist walking into an emergency room with a white count of 12, 13, 14 may not have appendicitis or an infection. That may just be their baseline, normal level, given all the inflammation they have in their body from the excess fat. So normal levels are not necessarily healthy levels. It's like smoking. If you take identical twins and one smokes and the other doesn't, the smoker is going to end up with a significantly higher white cell count. In Japan, for example, as smoking rates have steadily dropped, so has the normal white count range, such that about 8% of never-smoking men would now be flagged as having abnormally low white counts if you used a cutoff like 4, but that's because most people were smoking before when they set that cutoff. So maybe 3 would be a better lower limit. The inflammation caused by smoking may actually be one of the reasons cigarettes increase the risk of heart attacks, strokes, and other inflammatory diseases. So do people who have lower white counts have less heart disease, cancer, and overall mortality? Yes, yes, and yes. People with lower white blood cell counts live longer. Even within the normal range, every 1-point drop may be associated with a 20% drop in the risk of premature death. This is a log scale, so there's like an exponential increase in risk as white count goes up, even within the so-called normal range. This is for men. The same is found for women. The white blood cell count is a widely available, inexpensive measure of systemic inflammation. At around age 85 in this study, half of women who started out with white blood cell counts under 5.6 were still alive, whereas 80% of those that started out over 7 were dead. And 7, 8, 9, 10 would be considered normal. Being at the high normal range may place one at 3 times the risk of dying from heart disease compared to being at the lower end. Same link found for African American men and women. Same in middle age. Same at age 75. Same at age 85. Same even in our 20s and 30s. A 17% increase in coronary artery disease incidence for every single point higher. The higher your white count, the worse your arterial function, and the stiffer your arteries. So no wonder white blood cell count, WBC count, is a useful predictor of artery disease in your heart, brain, legs, and neck, and high blood pressure, even diabetes, according to a compilation of 20 different studies. Everything from fatty liver disease to having an enlarged prostate. And having a higher white blood cell count is associated with an increased risk of dying from cancer as well. And these are all within the normal range. So what would the ideal range be? A higher white blood cell count may be an important predictor for cardiovascular disease incidence and mortality, cancer mortality, all-cause mortality, a decline in lung function. So an important predictor for heart attacks, strokes, declining lung function, dying from cancer, and premature death in general. No surprise, as the number of white blood cells we have circulating in our bloodstream is a marker of systemic inflammation. Our body produces more white blood cells day to day in response to inflammatory insults. We've known about this link between higher white counts and heart attacks since the 70s, when we found that higher heart attack risk was associated with higher white blood cell counts, just like it was with higher cholesterol levels and higher blood pressures. Something that's been found in nearly every study done since then. Decades of studies involving hundreds of thousands of patients showing dramatically higher mortality rates in those with higher white counts. But why? Why does white blood cell count predict mortality? Maybe because it's a marker of inflammation and oxidation in our body. In fact, maybe even a biomarker for how fast we're aging. But it may be more than just an indicator of inflammation, but an active player, contributing directly to disease via a variety of mechanisms, including the actual obstruction of blood flow. The average diameter of white blood cells is like 7.5 micrometers, whereas our tiniest vessels are only like 5 micrometers wide. So the white blood cell has to squish down into like a sausage shape to squeeze through. And when there's inflammation present, these cells can get sticky. Here's more images of a white blood cell plugging up a vessel as it exits a small artery, trying to squeeze into a capillary, slowing down or even momentarily stopping blood flow. And if it gets stuck there, it can end up releasing all its internal weaponry, normally reserved for microbial invaders, and damage our blood vessels. This may be why in the days leading up to a stroke or heart attack, you may find a spike in the white cell count. Whether white count is just a marker of inflammation or an active participant, it's better to be on the low side. How can we reduce the level of inflammation in our body? Staying away from even secondhand smoke can help drop your white count about 0.5 point. Those that exercise also appear to have an advantage, but you don't know if it's cause and effect unless you put it to the test. 2 months of Zumba classes, just 1 or 2 hours a week, led to about a 1.5-point drop in white count. In fact, maybe that's one of the reasons exercise is so protective. But is that just because they lost weight? Fitness and fatness appear to both play a role. More than half, 51.5% of obese persons with low fitness, have white counts above 6.6. But those who are more fit or who have less fat are less likely to be up that high. Of course, that could just be because exercisers and leaner individuals are eating healthier, eating less inflammatory diets. How do we know excess body fat itself increases inflammation, increases the white count? You'd have to find some way to get people to lose weight without changing their diet or exercise. How is that possible? Liposuction. If you suck about a quart of fat out of people, you can significantly drop their white count by about 1 point. So maybe this should get us to rethink the so-called normal reference range for white blood cell count. Maybe we should revise it downward like we've done for cholesterol and triglycerides. Up until now, we've just based normal values on people that might be harboring significant background inflammatory disease. If you just restrict it to those with normal C-reactive protein, another indicator of inflammation, then instead of normal being 4.5 to 10, maybe we should instead revise it closer to 3 to 9. Okay, but where did the healthiest populations fall? Those not suffering from the ravages of chronic inflammatory diseases like heart disease and common cancers. Populations eating diets centered around whole plant foods average about 5, whereas in the U.S. at the time was closer to 7 or 8. The reason we know it's not genetic is if you take those living on traditional rural African diets, who are down around 4 or 5, and move them to Britain, they end up closer to 6, 7, or 8. Ironically, the researchers thought this was a good thing, referring to the lower white counts on the uncivilized diet as neutropenic, meaning too few white blood cells. They noted that during an infection or pregnancy, where you really do need more white cells, the white count came right up to wherever necessary. So bone marrow of those eating traditional plant-based diets had the capacity to create as many white cells as needed, but suffers from understimulation. They're just not smoking enough cigarettes and eating as many inflammatory foods. Similar findings were reported in Western plant eaters, with an apparent stepwise drop in white count as diets got more and more plant-based. But maybe there are non-dietary factors, such as lower smoking rates in those eating healthier? What you need are interventional trials to put it to the test. Just 21 days of removing meat, eggs, dairy, alcohol, and junk affected a significant drop in white count, even in people who started out down at 5.7. Those that started out even higher, patients with rheumatoid arthritis starting up around 7, no change in the control group that didn't change their diet, but a 1.5-point drop within a month on whole food plant-based nutrition. That's a 20% drop. That's more than the drop in inflammation one might get quitting a 28-year pack-a-day smoking habit. The most extraordinary drop I've seen was in a study of 35 asthmatics after 4 months of a whole food plant-based diet. Their average white count dropped nearly 60%, from up around 12 down to 5, though there was no control group and not enough patients to achieve statistical significance. If white blood cell count is such a clear predictor of mortality, so inexpensive and reliable and available, why isn't it used more often for diagnosis and prognosis? Maybe it's a little too inexpensive. The industry seems more interested in fancy new risk factors you can bill for. Fibromyalgia is one of the most common joint and muscle diseases, afflicting millions of Americans. Characterized by widespread musculoskeletal pain and often accompanied by other symptoms, such as fatigue. The medical profession used to think it was all in people's heads, but today there's irrefutable evidence that it is indeed a disorder of the body and not just the mind. Back in 2003, an influential paper was published out of the Mayo Clinic, in which a shocking 93% of fibromyalgia-type patients were found to be vitamin D deficient, and so they concluded that all such patients are at high risk of severe vitamin D deficiency. But wait a second, said the skeptics. There was no control group. Where's the Mayo Clinic located? Minnesota. Maybe 90% of everyone in Minnesota is D deficient. When controlled studies were done, some did indeed find that those suffering from these kind of pain syndromes were significantly more likely to be D deficient, but other studies did not. Even if all the studies did, though, that doesn't mean that low vitamin D levels cause fibromyalgia. Maybe chronic widespread pain disorders like fibromyalgia cause low vitamin D. It's the sunshine vitamin after all, and fibromyalgia patients may not be running around outside as much as healthy controls. To know if vitamin D is contributing to the disease, you have to put it to the test. Studies like these found that the majority of those with pain syndromes and low D levels appeared to benefit from vitamin D supplementation, clinical improvement in up to 90% of patients. You can imagine how rife vitamin D deficiency is among Arab women in the Middle East. But these studies weren't controlled either. Maybe they would have gotten better on their own without the supplement, or maybe it was the placebo effect. There are many examples in the medical literature of treatments that looked great in uncontrolled trials, like hyperbaric oxygen therapy for multiple sclerosis, but when put to the test in randomized controlled trials, they failed miserably. And that's what seemed to happen in the first randomized controlled trial of vitamin D for a fibromyalgia-type syndrome in 2008. No significant difference in pain scores, though the study only lasted 3 months, and in that time researchers were only able to get vitamin D blood levels up to about 30. Unfortunately, no controlled study had ever been done pushing levels any higher until 2014. Fibromyalgia patients were given up to 2,400 units of D a day for 20 weeks, and so their D levels rose up to like 50. And then, once they stopped the vitamin D, levels came back down to match the placebo. And that was reflected in their pain scores. A significant drop in pain severity while they were on the D, and then back to baseline when they were off of it. The researchers concluded that this economical, in fact over-the-counter therapy, with a low side effect profile may well be considered in patients with fibromyalgia syndrome. There is an enormous variation in the rates of prostate cancer around the globe, with among the highest rates in the US and lowest rates in Asia, though that may be changing. The largest increase in prostate cancer rates in the world in recent decades has been in South Korea, for example, a 13-fold increase in prostate cancer death nationwide. They suggested the increase in animal foods may have played a role, since that was the biggest change in their diet over that period, nearly an 850% increase. This is consistent with what we know in general about foods and the prevention and management of prostate cancer. Tomatoes, broccoli family vegetables, and soy foods decrease risk, no clear benefit from fish, and an increased risk from meat and dairy. This may be because a diet based around whole plant foods effectively reduces inflammation in the body. There is a genetic factor. If you have a first-degree relative with prostate cancer, you may be at 3-fold higher risk, but non-genetic factors may increase your risk 300-fold. How do we know the low rates in Asia aren't genetic? Because when they move to the United States, their rates shoot up, and by the second generation they're almost caught up. This may be because of more Burger Kings and Dairy Queens, but could also be because of eating fewer protective foods, such as soy. A systematic review of all soy and prostate cancer population studies to date confirmed soy foods could lower the risk. But that's kind of a broad category. There's all sorts of soy foods. There's fermented soy foods like miso and tempeh, and unfermented foods like tofu and soy milk. Which is more protective? Researchers sifted through the studies, and it turns out that only the unfermented soy seemed to help. Tofu and soy milk consumption were associated with about a 30% reduction in risk, whereas there didn't appear to be any protection linked to fermented soy foods. A compilation of 13 observational studies on soy food consumption and the risk of prostate cancer found that soy foods appear to be protective. Observational studies as opposed to interventional studies. They observed what people were eating, but didn't intervene and try to change their diets. So they observed that men who ate more soy foods had lower rates of prostate cancer. But the problem with observation studies is that there could be confounding factors. Maybe people who choose to eat soy may also make other healthy lifestyle decisions, like eating more fruits and vegetables, and maybe that's actually why they have less cancer. Most of the studies tried to control for these other lifestyle factors, but you can't control for everything. Most of the studies were done in Asia, so maybe Tofu consumption is just a sign of eating more of a traditional diet. Maybe the reason non-tofu consumers got more cancer is that they had abandoned their traditional diet. If only there was a Western population that ate a lot of soy we could look at. There is. Seventh-day Adventists. In the 70s, more than 12,000 Adventist men were asked about their use of soy milk, and then they were followed for up to 16 years to see who got cancer and who did not. So does high soy milk intake reduce prostate cancer incidence? Frequent consumption of soy milk was associated with a whopping 70% reduction of the risk of prostate cancer. Similarly, in a multi-ethnic study that involved a number of groups, soy intake appeared protective in Latinos too. Prostate cells carry beta-type estrogen receptors, which appear to act as tumor suppressors, kind of a gatekeeper, inhibiting invasion, proliferation, and preventing the prostate cells from turning cancerous in the first place. And those are the receptors targeted by the phytoestrogens in soy, like genistein, which inhibits prostate cancer cell invasion and spread in a petri dish, at the kinds of levels one might get consuming soy foods. The prevention of metastases is critical, as death from prostate cancer isn't caused by the original tumor, but it's spread throughout the body, which explains recommendations for men with prostate cancer to consume soy foods as well. Wait a second, do you think the amazing results Dean Ornish and colleagues got, apparently reversing the progression of prostate cancer with a plant-based diet and lifestyle program, was because of the soy? It wasn't just a vegan diet, but a vegan diet supplemented with a daily serving of tofu and a soy protein isolate powder. There have been studies showing men given soy protein powders develop less prostate cancer than the control group, but what was the control group getting? Milk protein powder. Those randomized to the milk group got 6 times more prostate cancer, but is that from the beneficial effects of soy, or the deleterious effects of the dairy? Dairy products are not just associated with getting prostate cancer, but also dying from prostate cancer. Men diagnosed with prostate cancer who then ate more dairy tended to die sooner, and both low-fat and high-fat dairy consumption were associated with an increased risk of a fatal outcome. The best study we have on soy protein powder supplementation for prostate cancer patients found no significant benefit, and neither did a series of soy phytoestrogen dietary supplements. Maybe that's because they just use isolated soy components rather than a whole soy food? Taking the whole food approach may be more efficacious. It's hard to do controlled studies with whole foods, though. I mean, you can make fake pills, but how do you give people placebo tofu? This group of Australian researchers got creative, coming up with a specially manufactured bread containing soy grits compared to just placebo regular bread, and then gave slices to men diagnosed with prostate cancer awaiting surgery. And in just about 3 weeks' time did see a remarkable difference. The first study to show a diet incorporating a whole soy food could favorably affect prostate cancer markers. But it's not like you can go out and buy soy grit bread. This study was a little more practical. 20 men with prostate cancer who were treated with radiation or surgery, but seemed to be relapsing, were asked to drink 3 cups of regular soy milk a day. Here's what happened to the PSA levels in each of the 20 patients before they started the soy milk. They were all rising, suggesting they had relapsing or metastatic cancer growing inside of them. Here's what happened during the year on soy milk. The blue lines are the folks where the soy milk appeared to have a positive effect, slowing or reversing the rise. The red lines represent those that got even worse during that period, and the black lines are those in which there appeared to be no significant change. So of the 20, 6 got better, 2 got worse, and the remaining 12 remained unchanged. So they conclude soy food may help in a subset of patients. Based on all these studies, the results Ornish got were probably more than just the soy. Similarly, the low prostate cancer rates in Asia are probably more than just the soy, since the lowest rates are also found in parts of Africa, and I don't think they're eating a lot of tofu in Africa. Indeed, in the multi-ethnic study, other types of beans besides soy also appeared protective for Latinos, and all the groups put together when looking at the most aggressive forms of prostate cancer. And so the protection associated with plant-based diets may be due to eating a variety of healthy foods. One way a diet rich in animal-sourced foods, meat, eggs, and cheese, may contribute to heart disease, stroke, and death is through the production of an atherosclerosis-inducing substance called TMAO. And with the help of certain gut bacteria, the choline and carnitine found concentrated in animal products can get converted into TMAO. But wait a second, I thought atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, was about the buildup of cholesterol. Cholesterol is still king. TMAO just appears to accelerate the process. TMAO appears to increase the ability of inflammatory cells within the atherosclerotic plaque in the artery wall to bind to LDL cholesterol, which makes them more prone to gobble up that cholesterol. So it's just another piece of the puzzle of how cholesterol causes heart disease. And TMAO doesn't just appear to worsen atherosclerosis, contributing to strokes and heart attacks, but also heart failure and kidney failure. If you look at a really high-risk group, like diabetics after a heart attack, nearly all those who started out with the most TMAO in their bloodstream went on to develop heart failure within 2,000 days, about 5 years, whereas only about 20% of those starting out with medium levels in the blood went into heart failure, and none in the low TMAO group. Not only do those with heart failure have higher levels of TMAO than controls, and those with worse heart failure have higher levels than those with lesser stage disease. If you follow people with heart failure over time, within 6 years, half of those who started out with the highest levels were dead. This finding has since been replicated in 2 other independent populations of heart failure patients. The question is why? It's probably unlikely to just be additional atherosclerosis, since that takes years. For most of those that die of heart failure, the heart muscle just conks out, or there's a fatal heart rhythm. So maybe TMAO has toxic effects beyond just the accelerated buildup of cholesterol. What about kidney failure? People with chronic kidney disease are at particularly increased risk for the development of cardiovascular disease, thought to be because of a diverse array of uremic toxins. These are toxins that would normally be filtered out by the kidneys into the urine, but may build up in the bloodstream as our kidney function declines. When we think of uremic toxins, we usually think of the toxic byproducts of protein putrefying in our gut, which is why specially formulated plant-based diets have been used for decades to treat chronic kidney failure. Those who eat vegetarian form less than half of these uremic toxins in the first place. But those aren't the only uremic toxins. TMAO, from the breakdown of choline and carnitine in mostly meat and eggs, may be increasing heart disease risk in kidney patients as well, by apparently downregulating reverse cholesterol transport, meaning subverting our own body's attempt at pulling cholesterol out of our arteries. And indeed, the worse our kidney function gets, the higher our TMAO levels rise, and those elevated levels correlate with the amount of plaque they have clogging up the arteries in their heart. But get a kidney transplant, get a working kidney going, and you can drop your TMAO levels right back down. So TMAO was thought to be kind of a biomarker for declining kidney function. But then this study was published from the Framingham Heart Study, which found that elevated choline and TMAO levels among individuals with normal kidney function predicted increased risk for developing chronic kidney disease, suggesting TMAO is both a biomarker and itself a kidney toxin. Indeed, when you follow kidney patients over time and assess their freedom from death, those with higher TMAO, even controlling for kidney function, live significantly shorter lives, indicating this diet-induced mechanism for progressive kidney scarring and dysfunction, strongly implying the need to focus preventative efforts on dietary modification. What might that look like? Well, maybe we should reduce dietary sources of TMAO generation, such as some species of deep-sea fish, eggs, and meat. But it also depends on what kind of gut bacteria you have. Remember, you can feed a vegan a steak, and they still don't really make any TMAO because they haven't been fostering the carnitine-eating bacteria in their gut. Researchers are hoping, however, that one day they'll find a way to replicate the effects of a vegetarian diet by selective prebiotic, probiotic, or antibiotic therapy.